It's easy to go from the coronavirus pandemic to economic management because the two are closely linked in the here and now. It's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for the Morrison government now to deliver its promised budget surplus. So let's have a bit of a look at how the media covers surpluses, deficits and forecasts. As usual, the coverage changes depending on which side of politics is in the frame. Remember when Wayne Swan announced not one, but 4 budget surpluses in 2012. This was 4 years after the global financial crisis hit, but so poor was Labor's economic management and so ambitious was its forecasting that it sparked immediate laughter.
The 4 years of surpluses I announced tonight are a powerful endorsement of the strength of our economy.
Still, some of the coverage at the time, especially over at the ABC, assumed the surplus was in the bank.
Welcome to this special federal budget program. Well, Wayne Swan has got his cherished surplus, but business is counting the cost. The federal treasurer has forecast a surplus of $1.5 billion next financial year and slim surpluses for the next 3 years.
We're joined now by our political correspondent Melissa Clark in Canberra. Melissa, good morning. Well, by hook or by crook, that surplus has been achieved.
Well, it hadn't. Within months, the budget night laughter was vindicated.
Now, obviously, dramatically lower tax revenue now makes it unlikely that there will be a surplus in 2012-13.
Unlikely. It was another $20 billion in Swan's record-breaking run of deficits. Fast forward to last year and Josh Frydenberg finally announced the coalition's much-awaited surplus.
I announce that the budget is back in the black and Australia is back on track.
Frydenberg and the Liberals certainly went big on the back in the black marketing, but most economists and commentators thought the assumptions were conservative and the surplus was likely to be delivered. Still, this time the media, bitten a few times to be sure in the past, were more wary.
You've said Australia is back in the black, but we're not quite yet, are we? We might be in surplus next year, but it hasn't actually happened yet.
Almost a year later, it seems clear the coronavirus has infected the economy, hitting tourism, education, trade, markets and confidence, and probably the surplus.
I mean, hands up those who thought there was going to be a coronavirus epidemic when the budget was released last May. Of course no one did.
The impact will be more significant than the bushfires and it plays out more broadly across the Australian economy.
OK, so that's where we are. Do you reckon we'd be able to find some inconsistent, paradoxical or hypocritical coverage of those scenarios across 8 years? You betcha. Check out Laura Tingle in 2012, then writing for the Australian Financial Review, justifying Swan's humiliating retreat on 4 announced surpluses. There are some pledges politicians don't want to break, and it cost Federal Treasurer Wayne Swan and his colleagues a lot to concede they weren't going to meet their 2010 commitment to return the budget to surplus this financial year, wrote Tingle. For a long time, they seemed poised on the precipice, unwilling to move, anticipating an inevitable political pasting over a broken promise. But this is a promise that common sense and almost any economist and businessman you care to meet says was right to break. OK then, so you'd expect Tingle to be forgiving now, wouldn't you?
The Prime Minister was saying today, well, who could have seen a year ago that a global pandemic was coming? But I seem to recall that he and the Treasurer were asked at the time, how could they be certain that an unexpected event wouldn't derail the projections that they were already claiming as a reality?
Yes, it was rather premature, as some of us noted at the time, Lee.
OK, so Labor's promise of 4 surpluses wasn't so premature. This surplus, blown out of the water by a pandemic no one could have predicted, was. Nine newspapers' economic correspondent Shane Wright was also critical. Writing under the headline, Morrison government is softening the ground for its much-vaunted surplus to disappear, Wright said the government had, quote, made clear the battle to return to budget surplus had been won. It was a victory claimed too early. But contrasting this with Swan's failures, he said Wayne Swan didn't know the world was about to enter its deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression. when he handed down his first budget in May of 2008. But hang on, Swan first promised his 2012 surplus in 2010, 2 years after the GFC hit. And he announced 4 surpluses in 2012 when the GFC was long gone. And what about this from Guardian columnist Stephen Koukoulas 10 days ago? "Fancy aiming for a budget surplus and never achieving it," he tweeted. That was a strange attack, given that just months ago he'd suggested abandoning the surplus.
The case for a budget surplus, for the sake of running a budget surplus, is a very poor one at a time when we've got the economy muddling along.
And this was the same Koukoulas who wrote in July 2012, not long after Swan's prediction of 4 consecutive budget surpluses, that the 2012-13 budget surplus seems assured. Economy at least as strong as budget time. My hunch is the surplus will be double the one projected. Doubled. But when Swan sheepishly admitted that surplus wasn't going to be happening, Koukoulas merely tweeted, "Some people have kittens in Australia over whether there's a surplus of $1 billion or a deficit of $1 billion." That's some spin, and the deficit, of course, turned out to be $20 billion, a turnaround almost as dramatic as the Kooks flipping and flopping. It helps to know that Koukoulas was economics advisor to Prime Minister Julia Gillard in 2010 and 2011, back in the days when Swan was mangling his forecasts and chewing through budget deficits. Interestingly enough, this is not a part of the Kooks' work history that is mentioned on The Guardian's little bio about their contributor, nor often during his many ABC appearances. And let's check in on Paul Bongiorno, the former Channel 10 political reporter. Last May, he described the predicted budget surplus as an admission of failure after promising to return a surplus every year if they were elected in 2013. Yet this is the same bloke who seemed very forgiving of Labor's Swan back in 2012 when he kissed goodbye to his surpluses. It's passing strange that an economically rational decision re-surplus equals incompetence, he tweeted. Yep, with many who cover politics, the virtue of a surplus or problems of a deficit have less to do with economics than they do with which party is in power. And even their rational scepticism about economic forecasting can kick in or totally disappear according to the ideology of the party or the issue involved. Listen to Nine Newspapers' David Crowe discussing this year's budget forecasts on Radio National.
I think almost all hope of the budget surplus is gone. I think that it's very close to being line ball, if not into small numbers in deficit. And I think that's what the government is preparing the people of Australia for at the moment. They can't say it yet because they don't have the Treasury modelling from Treasury officials and because it's so hard to predict what's happening with the coronavirus around the world.
Will it matter politically, David?
I think it will matter politically because there'll always be a political argument given that this coalition has, since 2013, warned about debt and deficit disasters. So that's their own rhetoric and they'll be judged by their rhetoric.
OK, that's tough but fair. But we all know forecasts are difficult over a year, harder over a 3-year electoral cycle and virtually impossible over a decade. Yet just seconds after that exchange, what did Crowe have to say about Labor's promise that it could deliver a net zero emissions target in 2050? Just think about this. This is a process spanning 30 budgets, 10 elections, and directly related to what nearly 200 other nations are doing. What unexpected events, technologies or knowledge could spring up over another 30 years? Well, apparently nothing that could knock this promise off course.
Nobody there was saying net zero is really difficult, it's going to be this huge problem for the country. Most people can see the economics of the energy sector changing in a way which makes net zero by 2050 quite possible. In fact, probably the outcome.
Probably the outcome. That's our sceptical media. Sceptical of everything uttered by Conservative treasurers, of course, but fully subscribed, fully on board, completely incurious and dewy-eyed about any proposition put by the Green left climate zealots. I guess we'll all have to check how that turns out in 2050, when Wayne Swan will be 4 surpluses short of 100.